I'm 80 years old. For 60 years, I thought I knew my husband. He was a math teacher, or so I believed, quiet and kind. Then, when he was 90, the FBI showed up at our door. They said he was a KGB agent, a spy, working with the mafia. My husband had secrets I never imagined. He told them everything, and I heard it all. I loved a man I didn't know. Now, I'm sharing my story, not for tears or pity, but because even at 80, I've learned you can start over. My name is Margaret, but most people call me Maggie. I was born in the late 1940s in a small town in Ohio, and by the time the 1980s came, I was already married with 2 children. If you had seen me then, you would have thought I lived a very ordinary American life. I had a husband who worked as a math teacher, 2 kids who went to school, and a small house with a white fence. From the outside, it looked like a picture-perfect life. My husband's name was David. Everyone in our neighborhood respected him. He was quiet, polite, always carried a stack of papers under his arm, and spent evenings grading tests or preparing lessons. Parents of his students would always say how lucky I was to have a husband like him. He wasn't just smart, he was also very patient and had a calm way of explaining complicated things. To me, he was simply my husband, the man I cooked for, argued with sometimes, and shared a bed with. We met in college. Back then, he was already different from most young men. While others drank, played football, or chased girls, David was always reading books or sitting in the library. He had this intensity about him, a kind of seriousness that made you feel he was older than his years. I think that's what drew me to him. I believed he was safe, reliable, someone who would never hurt me. He wasn't flashy, not very talkative, but when he looked at you, you felt like he could really see into your soul. We married young, right after graduation. I thought our life would be simple. Work, family, maybe some vacations, raising children, and then one day retiring together. And for many years, that's exactly how it looked. I worked as a secretary in an office, and David worked at the high school. We didn't have much money, but we had enough. We had a small house with a yard, and in the evenings we would sit on the porch drinking coffee, watching the children play. But looking back now, I realized that there were signs, small signs, things that didn't make sense. For example, David would sometimes disappear for a day or 2 without explanation. He would say it was a teacher's conference or a meeting with colleagues, but he never brought back any notes or stories about what happened there. He didn't like to talk about those trips at all. When I asked too many questions, he would just smile and change the subject. Another thing, sometimes he had money that we couldn't explain. Our salaries were modest, but every once in a while he would bring home an expensive gift, like a necklace for me or a fancy toy for the children. When I asked where it came from, he would say he got a bonus or that he had saved up. I wanted to believe him, so I did. Back then, during the Cold War, people in America were always suspicious of spies. You heard about the KGB, about the Russians, about double agents. But never in my life would I have imagined that my husband could be one of them. To me, he was just a teacher. He taught algebra, geometry, and calculus. He wore glasses, carried chalk dust on his sleeves, and came home smelling like coffee and paper. The truth didn't come out until many years later. By then, our children were grown, and we were already old. David was 90 years old when the FBI came to our door. I will never forget that day. But before I tell you about that moment, I need to take you back to the 1980s when everything seemed so normal, and yet under the surface, nothing was as it seemed. The 1980s were a strange time in America. On one hand, it was the era of bright colors, big hair, loud music, and growing technology. On the other hand, it was the height of the Cold War. People feared nuclear war. They feared Russia. Every movie had spies, secret agents, and men in suits exchanging briefcases in dark alleys. In our town, life was quiet, far away from all that. I worked, raised the kids, cooked dinner, and worried about bills. We didn't travel much. David said traveling was unnecessary. He always wanted to stay close to home. At the time, I thought it was because he was a simple man who didn't care for adventures. Later, I learned the truth. He stayed close because he was always watching, always waiting for instructions. One of the things that stands out in my memory is how David never had close friends. He was friendly enough, but he kept his distance. Even with the neighbors, he was polite, but never personal. People thought he was shy, maybe just a little introverted. But I know now it wasn't shyness. It was secrecy. He couldn't risk anyone getting too close. Sometimes, late at night, I would wake up and find him gone from our bed. I'd walk into the living room and see him sitting in the dark, smoking a cigarette. David didn't even smoke regularly, but on those nights, he would sit quietly staring at nothing, lost in thought. If I asked him what was wrong, he would smile faintly and say, "Just thinking about work." I believed him. I had no reason not to, but deep down, a part of me always felt that something wasn't quite right. I remember one evening in 1985. David came home late, much later than usual. He looked pale, almost shaken, and his hands were trembling. I asked him what had happened, and he said one of his students had been in an accident. But the next day, when I asked about the student, David didn't even remember the boy's name. That was the first time I really doubted him. But then he hugged me, kissed my forehead, and said he was just tired, and I pushed the doubt away. After all, I loved him. He was the father of my children. I couldn't allow myself to believe something was seriously wrong. Now that I know everything, I can see the puzzle pieces, the lies, the absences, the unexplained money, the secret of nature. But at the time, I was just a wife trying to make life work. I trusted my husband for decades. David carried this secret life right under my nose. He pretended to be a teacher, but behind that mask, he was something entirely different, a KGB agent working with the mafia. I know this sounds like a story from a movie, but I swear to you, it happened. And now, in my old age, I feel I must share it. Because maybe, just maybe, someone out there will understand what it's like to live beside a stranger, thinking you know him, when in reality, you never did. When we first settled in America, I thought I had everything I ever dreamed of. Our little house in New Jersey wasn't perfect, but it was ours. The walls were thin, the pipes rattled in the winter, and the backyard was more weeds than grass, but to me, it was freedom. After growing up in a small, strict household in Ohio, being married and living on our own felt like stepping into the wide open world. My husband, Robert, at least that's what everyone called him, was a math teacher at the local high school. He wore plain suits to work, carried a brown leather briefcase, and smelled faintly of pipe tobacco. He was gentle with me, patient when I burned dinner or when our sink leaked, and he read bedtime stories with funny voices when our first daughter was born. To neighbors and friends, He was the picture of stability, reliable, quiet, maybe even a little boring. And I loved that. We had two children in the 1980s, first our daughter, then our son. The years were busy and noisy. I was a stay-at-home mom at first, juggling diapers, laundry, and meals. Robert provided for us on his teacher's salary, and while money was often tight, he never complained. He used to say, "Math is the one language the world will always need. As long as I can teach numbers, we'll be fine." Looking back now, I realize how carefully crafted those words were. He always had a way of answering questions without really answering them. If I asked about his family back in Europe, he would give me vague stories about a cousin in Moscow or an uncle who farmed wheat. But whenever I pressed for details, birthdays, names, or childhood memories, he would change the subject. I chalked it up to pain, to a past he didn't want to revisit. I told myself not everyone was open about their upbringing. Still, little things never quite added up. For instance, our bills were always paid on time, even when I knew his teacher's paycheck wouldn't stretch far enough. I once asked him how he managed it. He smiled, kissed me on the forehead, and said he was good at balancing numbers. I assumed he meant budgeting. Only later did I realize he meant something very different. There were also the visitors. Every once in a while, a man in a dark suit would show up at our door. He always spoke in a heavy accent, Russian maybe, though at the time I wasn't sure. They would sit in the kitchen with cups of coffee, speaking in low voices. When I entered the room, they would stop talking. Robert would introduce them as old friends from school or colleagues from Europe passing through. I believed him because I wanted to believe him. In the early 1980s, America was buzzing with the Cold War atmosphere. On television, we saw news about the Soviet Union, nuclear weapons, spies, and secret missions. Movies painted Russians as villains in trench coats. Sometimes I would joke with Robert, asking if his mystery friends were spies. He would chuckle softly and say, "Oh, darling, if only life were that exciting. We're just teachers living ordinary lives." But ordinary life has a way of showing cracks. One evening in 1984, Robert came home late, much later than usual. His knuckles were bruised, and his shirt collar was torn. I panicked, thinking he'd been mugged. He shrugged it off, saying he had intervened in a fight outside a bar while waiting for a bus. I believed him because I wanted to, but in my heart something felt wrong. A math teacher getting into brawls? It didn't fit. Over the years, I noticed he had a remarkable ability to connect with all kinds of people. At the grocery store, he would chat with the cashier in Spanish. At a gas station, he'd speak with a mechanic in broken Italian. Once when we visited New York City, he struck up a conversation in flawless Russian with a stranger on the subway. I laughed and asked how many languages he knew. He shrugged and said numbers and languages weren't so different. They both required patterns. I should have asked more questions. I should have looked deeper. But when you're raising kids, folding laundry, cooking dinner, and worrying about bills, it's easy to accept the answers that bring peace. I told myself I had a good life and a good husband. Why stir the waters? By the late 1980s, things seemed steady. Our children were in school, Robert was respected at his job, and we had even managed to save for small vacations. We visited the beach in summer, went camping in the fall, and decorated our house with too many Christmas lights in December. Neighbors would laugh and say, "You're the picture of the American dream." And I believed them. It wasn't until much later, decades later, when Robert was an old man in his 90s, that I learned the truth. He wasn't just a math teacher. He wasn't just a quiet immigrant who loved his family. He was a KGB agent planted in America, a man who carried secrets in his briefcase instead of lesson plans, a man who worked with people far more dangerous than any school principal. But back then, in the 1980s, I was blind to it. I was just a wife, a mother trying to build a home. If I had looked closer at the bruises, the visitors, the hidden money, maybe I would have seen the storm waiting on the horizon. But I didn't. I held on to the image of the man who read bedtime stories, who helped our daughter with fractions, who taught our son to ride a bike. That was the man I loved, and that was the man I thought I married. Only years later did I realize I had married a stranger. When I look back at those years in the 1980s, I realize now there were so many signs. But at the time, I was too busy being a wife, a mother, and a young woman trying to find her way in America. My husband, whom I'll call Victor, was a math teacher at the local high school. He was quiet, polite, and always respected by his colleagues. Parents trusted him. Students admired him. And I thought I had married a simple, good, hardworking man. But there were things I never questioned, things I should have questioned. For example, Victor often left the house at night. He would tell me he had to grade papers at school or help a struggling student. Sometimes he said he had meetings with the math department. I didn't think much about it back then. After all, he was a teacher, and teachers often spend long hours outside the classroom. But now I know he was not grading papers. He was meeting people, people who were not from the school at all. Another strange thing was money. Teachers don't make a lot of money, and I knew that. Yet, somehow, Victor always had cash. He bought a new car in the mid-80s. He gave me jewelry for my birthday, even though I never asked for expensive gifts. When I asked him where the money came from, he always laughed and said, "I save well. I am careful." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to think I had a responsible husband who managed money better than most. Then there were the phone calls. Late at night, the phone would ring. Victor would answer in Russian, even though he almost never spoke Russian at home. He came from the Soviet Union years before, but he rarely shared much about his past. Whenever I asked, he would brush it off. The past is gone. Only the present matters. But sometimes, when he thought I wasn't listening, he spoke Russian fluently and fast, as if he was reporting something. Once I even asked him, "Victor, why are you always speaking Russian on the phone? Who are you talking to?" He smiled and said, "Old friends from my home. They miss me." It sounded innocent enough. But in my heart, I felt something was not right. Still, life went on. We raised our children. We went to church. We attended barbecues with the neighbors. Everyone thought we were a normal American family. And maybe that's why I never dug deeper. Maybe I didn't want to destroy the illusion of safety and normal life. But there were cracks, small cracks that grew bigger with time. One evening in 1987, Victor came home late. His shirt smelled of smoke, not cigarette smoke, but something heavier, like the smoke from a bar or maybe even a fire. I asked him what happened. He said there had been a small accident near school, and he stayed to help. But his hands were trembling as he poured himself a glass of vodka. He never explained more, and I didn't push. Another time, I found an envelope in his jacket pocket. Inside were several photographs. They showed men in dark suits standing near a warehouse. The pictures looked like they were taken secretly from a distance. I froze when I saw them. When I asked Victor, he grabbed the envelope and said, "You should not touch things that don't belong to you." His tone was sharp, harsher than ever before. I felt afraid of him in that moment. And then there was the night I overheard him arguing with someone on the phone. His voice was louder than usual, angry. He kept saying words like shipment, money, and danger. I stayed silent in the kitchen, listening with my heart beating fast. When he hung up, he saw me standing there. For the first time, he looked at me not like his wife, but like a stranger. Cold, distant, almost threatening. He said only one sentence: "Do not ask questions you do not want answered." That was the moment I knew. My husband was not just a teacher. Something bigger, something darker was happening. But I still didn't know what. Years later, when he was 90 years old and arrested, the truth came out. He was not just Victor the math teacher. He was an agent of the KGB. He had connections with the mafia. He lived a double life for decades, hiding in plain sight. And his wife, never really knew who he was. At least, not until it was too late. I remember the day so clearly. It was a bright morning, and the sun was shining through the curtains of our small living room. I was sitting on the couch, holding a cup of coffee in my hands, when the phone rang. At first, I thought it would be just another ordinary call from one of my children or maybe a friend checking in on me. But instead, it was a call that turned my whole world upside down. The voice on the other side of the line was from a police officer. He sounded calm, but serious. He asked me if I was the wife of Michael Peterson. I said yes. Then he told me that my husband had been arrested. My heart stopped for a second. Arrested? For what? Michael was 90 years old. He could hardly walk without his cane, and his back always hurt. What could he possibly have done? The officer told me that Michael had been under investigation for a long time, and now the authorities had enough evidence to detain him. They wanted me to come down to the station. I didn't even know what to say. I hung up the phone and sat there, frozen, with my coffee going cold in my hands. When I finally managed to stand up, I put on my coat and walked out the door. My legs were shaking as I made my way to the bus stop. On the ride to the station, my mind kept racing. I thought maybe it was a mistake. Maybe they confused him with someone else. Maybe he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. But when I got to the police station, the truth was waiting for me. I was led into a small room. The walls were gray, and there was a table with 2 chairs. Michael was sitting there. His hands were on the table, and he looked tired. When he saw me, he didn't even try to smile. His face was serious, and his eyes were heavy, as if he had been carrying a secret for a very long time. I sat down across from him. "What's going on, Michael?" I asked. My voice was trembling. He took a deep breath. "Anna," he said softly, "there's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you a long time ago." I felt my stomach turn. My hands started to shake, and I gripped the edge of the table. "I wasn't just a math teacher," he continued. "All those years when I said I was staying late at school or working on extra projects, that wasn't the truth. I was living a double life." I stared at him, unable to understand what he meant. "I was working for the KGB," he said, finally. His voice was low but steady. I was an agent. They sent me here in the 1980s, and I built a life with you, but I was also sending information back to Moscow. And later, I got involved with people I should never have trusted. The mafia. They used me, and I worked with them because I thought it was the only way to survive. For a moment, the room was completely silent. I could hear the sound of my own breathing, fast and shallow. My mind refused to believe what I had just heard. "You're lying," I whispered. "This isn't real. You were a teacher. You helped kids with math. You came home every night. We had dinner together. You tucked our children into bed. How could you? How could you possibly be?" But he interrupted me. "I'm not lying, Anna. I'm telling you the truth. I kept it from you because I wanted to protect you. I didn't want you to know what kind of man I really was." I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. All those years we spent together, all the moments I thought were real, suddenly they felt like lies. Tears filled my eyes. "So our whole life together, it was just a cover? Was I just part of your act?" "No," he said quickly, leaning forward. His eyes were desperate now. "That part was real. I loved you. I still love you. You and the children, you were the only true thing in my life. Everything else was duty, lies, and survival. But my love for you was real. I didn't know whether to believe him. I wanted to believe him because the thought that my whole life had been a lie was unbearable. But at the same time, I couldn't ignore the truth that was now in front of me. The officer in the room gave us a little time. Michael kept talking. He told me about his missions, about the people he had to meet, about the secrets he carried. He even told me how he got involved with the mafia in New York during the late 1980s. They offered him money, protection, and access to information. And in return, he helped them with numbers, with codes, with strategies. It was like listening to a story from a movie. But it wasn't a movie, it was my life. My husband, the man I thought I knew better than anyone, had been living in shadows all along. When I finally left the station, I felt numb. The sun was still shining outside, but for me, everything had turned dark. I walked home slowly, trying to process what I had just learned. That night, I sat alone in our house, surrounded by photographs of our family, pictures of our children when they were young, pictures of us at the beach, at Christmas, at birthdays. And now I kept asking myself, how much of this was real? How much of this was just part of his disguise? In the weeks that followed, Michael remained in custody. There were hearings, investigations, and endless news reports. Suddenly, our quiet life was in the spotlight. Neighbors whispered. Old friends called me, shocked, asking if it was true. I didn't know what to say to them. I didn't even know what to say to myself. And yet, despite everything, I visited him. I needed answers. I needed to hear his story, all of it, because even though I was angry and broken, I still loved him. He was still the man who had held my hand when I was sick, who had rocked our babies to sleep, who had kissed me good night for decades. During one of those visits, he looked at me and said, "Anna, I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even deserve it. But I need you to know that in the middle of all the lies, my love for you was the only truth I ever held onto." I didn't respond right away. I just looked at him, an old man now, fragile and worn out, yet still carrying the weight of all his secrets. In that moment, I realized something. This was not just his story anymore. It was also mine. And one day, when the time was right, I would share it with the world. Because people needed to know what it felt like to live with someone who was both a husband and a stranger, a teacher and a spy, a father and a criminal. That was the day I decided I would not keep silent. I never thought the day would come when I would see my husband sitting in a courtroom, his hands cuffed, his face pale and tired, but still with that strange calmness in his eyes. He was 90 years old, yet in that moment, I could see both the young man I had fallen in love with in the 1980s and the stranger he had become through all those secret years. When the police first arrested him, I thought there must be a mistake. A 90-year-old man, accused of being a KGB agent and connected to the mafia? It sounded like something from a movie, not my life. But as the weeks passed, and as investigators shared pieces of information with me, I realized that everything I had built my life on was not as it seemed. The courtroom was quiet that day. A few journalists sat in the back, their notebooks ready. Our children were not there. They refused to come. They said they couldn't bear to see their father like that. And honestly, I didn't blame them. When the judge asked him to speak, my husband stood slowly. His voice was soft but clear. "Yes, Your Honor," he said. "I was a KGB agent. For many years, I worked under orders gathering information in the United States. I also had connections with men who were not only spies, but criminals. Some of them were part of organized crime groups. I did what I was told to do." My hands shook when I heard those words. After all these years, the truth was finally spoken out loud. He didn't deny it. He didn't try to protect himself. He just confessed. I sat there in silence, staring at him. Memories rushed through my head. The nights he came home late, the phone calls he took in the kitchen with the door closed. The trips he said were school conferences. I had believed him. I had trusted him. Was I blind, or did I simply not want to see the truth? After the hearing, I went home alone. Our house felt colder than ever. I sat at the kitchen table and cried. I thought about the life we had lived. We had raised children, celebrated birthdays, struggled with bills, argued about little things like groceries and television. To me, we were just an ordinary American family. But behind that mask, he had lived another life, a life filled with lies and danger. A week later, he asked to see me. At first, I didn't want to go. I felt betrayed. But then I thought, I deserve answers. So I went. He was sitting in a small room at the prison behind a glass window. He picked up the phone, and so did I. "I'm sorry," he said. His eyes looked tired, but not empty. "I should have told you long ago, but I couldn't. It wasn't allowed. And later, it was too late." "Why?" I asked. "Why did you do it? Why lie to me for all those years?" He sighed. "When I was young, I believed in the mission. I believed I was serving my country. Then, when we got married, I thought I could balance both lives. But I was wrong. Every day, I was lying to you, and I hated myself for it. But by then, I was trapped. If I confessed, I would have put you in danger too." "In danger?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Yes," he said quietly. "The mafia men I worked with, they were dangerous. If I had betrayed them, they would not have spared me or you or the children." I didn't know what to say. My heart was torn between anger and pity. The investigators later explained more. In the 1980s and 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed, many former spies lost their support. Some turned to crime. My husband had used his contacts to survive. He had helped criminals launder money. He had passed information to both sides, sometimes to Moscow, sometimes to American gangs. It sounded unbelievable. My husband, the math teacher, the quiet man who spent evenings grading papers at the kitchen table, had lived in the shadows of both intelligence and organized crime. And the most shocking part, nobody had caught him for decades. He had lived in plain sight as an ordinary American citizen, while hiding one of the darkest secrets. I cannot describe the storm of emotions inside me. There was anger, yes, anger that he had lied to me, that he had used me, that our family was built on secrets. But there was also sadness. I looked at him and saw an old man who had wasted his life in shadows. Sometimes late at night, I asked myself, did he love me at all? Or was I just part of his cover story? I remember asking him that once during another visit. Tell me the truth. I said, did you marry me because you loved me or because you needed a wife for your cover? He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw tears in his eyes. I loved you, he said. That was the only real thing in my life. Everything else was lies, but you were the truth. I never wanted to lose you. Those words broke me. I wanted to believe him. A part of me did, but another part wondered if even that was another lie. After his confession became public, everything changed. Neighbors looked at me differently. Some whispered behind my back. She must have known, they said. How could she not know? But I didn't know. I swear I didn't. Our children refused to speak to him. They said he was dead to them. They changed their last names, wanting no connection to him. I tried to convince them to forgive, at least a little, but they were too angry. They felt their entire childhood had been stolen. As for me, I kept visiting him. Not often, but enough. Maybe it was weakness. Maybe it was love. Or maybe it was just the need to understand, to hear more pieces of the truth before it was too late. One day, he told me something that still echoes in my mind. You know, he said, spying is not like in the movies. It's not glamorous. It's lonely. Every day, I had to pretend to be a simple teacher, pretend to be a normal husband, pretend that I wasn't betraying everyone around me. The truth is, I betrayed everyone, my country, my comrades, the mafia, even you. And now, at the end of my life, I sit here with nothing. I didn't know how to respond. I just sat there, holding the phone, staring at him. He was right. At the end of it all, he had nothing. No family beside him, no friends, no freedom. Just a pile of lies and a broken past. Now, when I think about my life, I see it in two layers. One was the life I lived, the birthdays, the family dinners, the daily struggles of a middle-class woman in America. The other was the life he lived, the lies, the spying, the mafia deals. For decades, those two lives existed side by side, like two parallel worlds. And then, at 90 years old, those worlds finally collided. I often ask myself, was my life wasted? Did I live in a shadow without knowing it? Or was it still real, even if he was living a lie? Maybe both. Maybe love and lies can exist in the same space, tangled so tightly that you can't separate them anymore. As I tell you this story, I don't expect sympathy. I don't expect people to understand. I just want the truth to be heard. My husband lived a double life, and I lived half a life without knowing it. But now, At least I can tell the story in my own words. He once told me that secrets are like debts. Sooner or later, you must pay them back. He paid his debt too late, when most of his life was already gone. And I am left with the memory of a man I both loved and hated, a man who was my husband and yet a stranger all along. Life after Peter's retirement was quieter on the surface, but I always felt something unsettled underneath. He had grown older, slower, but his mind remained sharp. At times, I would catch him staring out the window for long stretches, lost in thought, as though waiting for someone or remembering a distant past. I used to ask him what he was thinking about, and he always brushed it off with a smile and said, "Just old man's thoughts." We spent our days like many elderly couples, walks in the park, doctor's visits, watching television together. He loved the news. He watched every political program, every international update, always analyzing things with a deeper intensity than an average retired math teacher would. He would comment on foreign leaders, world conflicts, intelligence leaks, always with an accuracy that surprised me. I remember once asking, "How do you know so much, Peter? You were just a teacher." He laughed and said, "I read a lot, Mary, more than you think." Our children visited us occasionally, though they had lives of their own now. Sometimes they would ask questions about his past. They wanted to know about his childhood, about his teaching years. He was vague, always turning the conversation back to them. Looking back, I realize he never really shared much about himself. His whole life was a performance, and I had been his longest audience. The truth finally came crashing down when he turned 90. By then, he was fragile but still mentally sharp. One morning, there was a knock on the door. Not the kind of knock you expect from a neighbor or the mailman. It was firm, heavy, demanding. I opened the door and saw two men in suits. They looked serious, official. They asked for Peter by his full name. My stomach dropped. Peter came to the door, leaning on his cane. He looked at them, and for a moment, his eyes gave away something I had never seen before, recognition mixed with resignation. He didn't protest. He didn't ask questions. He simply nodded, as though he had been expecting them. "Peter Ivanov," one of the men said, "we need to speak with you." They showed me their badges. FBI. My heart stopped. I couldn't believe it. I thought there must be a mistake. But Peter didn't argue. He didn't deny it. He simply said, "I'll come with you." I was in shock. I asked them what this was about, but they told me they would explain later. They let me follow them to the station. When we arrived, Peter finally confessed everything. Sitting in a small, plain room, he spoke with a calmness that chilled me. He admitted he had been a KGB agent during the Cold War. He said he had been planted in the United States decades ago, under the cover of being a teacher. He worked quietly, gathering information, building contacts, and this was the part that stunned me most. He had dealings with the mafia. I couldn't understand it at first. The mafia? He explained that during the 1980s, when he was supposedly just teaching math, he was also moving in dangerous circles. The mafia had resources, connections, ways of moving money, and information that even the KGB couldn't match. He had been a bridge between them, passing information, laundering funds, ensuring that both sides benefited. As he spoke, I felt as though the man I had lived with for more than 60 years was a stranger. My husband, the quiet, thoughtful teacher, had been living a second life right under my nose. He explained that everything he had done was for the mission, but he admitted almost proudly that he had been very good at it. The FBI agents listened, recording everything. They had apparently been watching him for years, waiting for him to slip up or confess. At 90, he finally did. Maybe he was tired of hiding. Maybe he wanted to leave this world with the truth spoken out loud. When they asked him why he never left the United States after the Soviet Union collapsed, he said, simply, "This became my home, and I love my family." Those words hit me hard, because even though he had lived a life of secrets and lies, I never doubted that he loved me in his own way. That was the cruelest part of it. After the interrogation, they let him return home on house arrest, considering his age and health. The trial would have taken years, and they knew he didn't have that much time left. So, in a strange way, we were back to our quiet life, but everything had changed. For weeks, I couldn't look at him the same way. Every memory I had of our life together was now colored by his secret. Our wedding day, the birth of our children, the nights we stayed up late talking, all of it was built on a foundation of lies. Yet, he was still the man who held my hand when I was sick, who read bedtime stories to our children, who made me tea when I was tired. How do you separate the two? The spy from the husband? One night, after the FBI had left, I sat across from him at the kitchen table. I asked him the question that had been burning inside me. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" He looked at me with tired eyes and said, "Because I wanted to protect you. If you knew, you would have been in danger too. You would have lived in fear. I couldn't do that to you." I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to tell him that the betrayal was worse than the fear. But I didn't, because deep down, I wasn't sure I wanted to know the truth back then either. Maybe he was right. Maybe ignorance had been my shield. As the months passed, his health declined. The FBI stopped coming as often, knowing he was nearing the end. He spent more time in bed, weaker each day. And in those quiet moments, when it was just the two of us, he spoke openly. He told me stories about his missions, about the risks he took, about the nights he thought he wouldn't come home. He admitted that he had lied so many times he sometimes forgot what the truth was. But he also told me he never regretted marrying me. He said that I was the only real part of his life, that everything else, the KGB, the mafia, the lies, was a role he played. But I was the only thing that was real. Those words broke me, because even after everything, a part of me still loved him. When he finally passed away, it was quiet, just the two of us at home. I held his hand until his last breath. The FBI came soon after, taking away boxes of his old papers and belongings. They told me his case would remain in the records, a strange footnote in the history of espionage. And now, here I am telling this story, because after so many years of silence, I don't want to carry this burden alone. People deserve to know that even the most ordinary lives can hide extraordinary secrets. I want others to understand the cost of lies, the weight of hidden truths, and the complexity of love tangled with betrayal. This is not just a story about espionage or crime. It is the story of a woman who lived her whole life beside a man she never fully knew, a man who was both my greatest love and my greatest deception. And that is why I finally decided to share it with all of you